Hi, my name is David Warner Matheson, and for over a decade I've been exploring the connections between the myths and the stars. Here's a photograph of me next to a sign that I drove past in the parking lot of a church on the way to the incredible Contact at the Cabin event in the Channeled Scablands in Washington State earlier this month, which was an event sponsored by the Grimerica Show podcast and the Brothers of the Serpent podcast team. The sign says, "Where will you spend eternity?" I took a photograph because the message on this sign to me represents some of the worst and most pernicious aspects of the system of biblical literalism, by which I mean a literalistic reading of the ancient texts preserved in what we call the Bible. The sacred stories found in the biblical scriptures, in common with the sacred stories preserved in cultures around the globe, on every inhabited continent and island of our earth, can be shown beyond doubt to be speaking a language of celestial metaphor. Thus, reading them in a literalistic manner, which ignores the fact that they are esoteric metaphor, actually inverts their message. Far from honoring these ancient scriptures, a literalistic interpretation turns their message on its head. The world's ancient myths can be shown to have as a central theme the repair of our alienation from ourself, the repair of trauma, trauma being defined as an alienation from our own self. However, literalistic misinterpretation of the ancient wisdom in the myths leads to an inversion of that central message, with the result that the literalistic misinterpretation actually leads to inflicting trauma instead of healing trauma. And that is exactly what we see in this sign and in the doctrine that is behind this sign, the teaching that is behind this sign. The question, "Where will you spend eternity?" carries a not so subtle threat that if you don't do something, you will spend eternity in endless torment and the fires of hell. This doctrine of eternal punishment and endless torment in hell is not a fringe teaching of literalist Christianity. It is, in fact, a central teaching of literalism. Here's a statement of faith from the Presbyterian Church in America, published on their main website, which explains that, quote, "We are under just condemnation to eternal ruin without defense or excuse. We are guilty of sinning against God, fallen from his favor, and under the curse of Genesis 3, and the promise of his right and just judgment of us in the future and forever is guaranteed to us," end quote. So just to recap, that says condemnation to eternal ruin, forever guaranteed. Here's the website of the Southern Baptist Convention with their statement of faith, which also places the doctrine of eternal punishment in hell at the center of their message. Like the statement we just read, it also references the story found in Genesis 3 of the temptation in the Garden of Eden. And upon that story, it bases the condemnation of all men and women, saying, quote, "By his free choice, man sinned against God and brought sin into the human race. Through the temptation of Satan, man transgressed the command of God and fell from his original innocence, whereby his posterity inherit a nature and an environment inclined towards sin. Therefore, as soon as they are capable of moral action, they become transgressors and are under condemnation," end quote. And then a few sections later, the Baptist Statement of Faith declares, quote, "God, in his own time and in his own way, will bring the world to its appropriate end, according to his promise, Jesus Christ will return personally and visibly in glory to the earth, the dead will be raised, and Christ will judge all men in righteousness. The unrighteous will be consigned to hell, the place of everlasting punishment. The righteous, in their resurrected and glorified bodies, will receive their reward and will dwell forever in heaven with the Lord. End quote. Note that this doctrine is directly linked to the story of the fall in the Garden of Eden found in the first chapters of Genesis. It is also explicitly linked with the command to go around and endeavor to convert all people to this same doctrine, which is spelled out in the next section of the Baptist Faith and Mission Statement, which declares, quote, "It is the duty of every child of God to seek constantly to win the lost to Christ by verbal witness, undergirded by a Christian lifestyle and other methods in harmony with the gospel of Christ." End quote. The lost, of course, means everyone who has not bought into this literalist misinterpretation of the ancient scriptures, and who thus stand, according to the misinterpretation that we just read, condemned to hell, the place of everlasting punishment. So these doctrines are all very closely linked, and they're in fact central to the literalist Christian project, which is in fact a colonizing project, a worldwide colonizing project, which is bound and determined to go to all people everywhere and tell them that whatever they have been believing is wrong and that they need to change and believe this literalist message, and that message is backed up with the threat of eternal damnation and hellfire. And that's what this sign on the side of the highway is implying. And that is a traumatizing message. It is a traumatizing message to teach the children, and it's also a traumatizing message to try and force onto adult men and women around the world. And this threat of condemnation and eternal punishment in the undying fires of hell forever and ever remains as the biggest howitzer in the literalist Christian conversion arsenal of mental weapons. And signs like this one are playing on the fact that you might have a sneaking doubt or some insecurity that says, what if they're right? What if I'm in danger of eternal, unending punishment and torment in the fires of hell forever and ever? That's what signs like this one are designed to get you to think to yourself and to ask yourself. Here's another sign that I saw on a billboard on my way back from the Washington trip. I've seen this sign before. This sign says, when you die, you will meet God, with the word will in italics to emphasize that it is certain to happen. There's no escape. There's a picture of an EKG readout, like a heartbeat monitor, and then it flatlines halfway across the billboard, which is a very unsubtle message implying the death of a human being. And in fact, it's implying the death of the reader of the sign, when you die. And the unsubtle message of this billboard is that you better get right with Jesus, or your meeting with God is not going to be a very pleasant one. And neither of these billboards even have to explicitly mention eternal punishment in the fires of hell, because that doctrine remains so ingrained in our culture that men and women still retain a sneaking fear of it, which these billboards are designed to awaken and intensify. The billboard that I saw was in California. I was driving. I didn't take a picture of it. But this one in the photo is actually in Detroit. But they're exactly the same. They're identical billboards because there's a group that's putting these up all over the country. And they are explicitly playing upon fear and the threat of punishment after death, which historically has been an extremely powerful tool of control over the people. And notice that the published statements of faith that I read from major denominations active in the United States and active with missionary projects, missionary arms, projects of conversion worldwide, these published statements are very explicit in declaring the certainty of eternal condemnation and torment in hell for the unrighteous, and that both of those doctrinal statements of belief link that teaching of eternal condemnation to the story of the fall described in Genesis 3. Now, I don't think that there are nearly as many men and women who maintain a sneaking doubt in their mind that perhaps a talking serpent approached Eve in the literal Garden of Eden and tempted her to take the literal forbidden fruit and to eat it and to give it to the man, Adam, who also ate it, bringing down eternal condemnation upon all of their offspring, of which all living men and women today are their literal offspring. I don't think there's that many people harboring a suspicion in their mind, oh, what if there really was a Garden of Eden with a talking serpent? There's probably not that many that are thinking about that, but it's explicitly linked to this doctrine of eternal punishment, and I do think that signs like this appear and are used because there is a sneaking doubt in people's mind. What if there is an eternal hellfire? Well, I'll tell you, I do not have any sneaking doubt, no hidden doubt whatsoever that the scriptures of the Bible are metaphor. I have no doubt whatsoever that the story of the serpent and Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is celestial metaphor. It can be shown to be celestial metaphor, and I have no doubt in my mind that the descriptions of hell and a fire that doesn't die out are celestial metaphor. And I can show beyond any doubt that the story of Adam and Eve is celestial and metaphorical in nature, and I have shown that. And I can show that it's teaching something different from what the literalists are misinterpreting it to be teaching, just as I can show beyond a doubt that the accounts of the end of the world or the end of the age found in the book of the Revelation of John are also celestial. They're using celestial language, they're based on celestial metaphor, and they are not literal either. But even though most men and women are not convinced of the historicity of a literal Adam and a literal Eve who lived in a literal garden and ate a fruit at the suggestion of a literal serpent, this fear of eternal condemnation involving burning in hell forever and ever, which is explicitly tied to the Adam and Eve story in the doctrinal statements that we looked at, remains frightening enough to many men and women, frightening enough to enable billboards such as the ones that I've shown here to play a role in this world-converting project of literalist Christianity, and as well as a motivation for men and women to support the project of sending out missionaries to try and convert men and women in other nations and cultures to literalist Christianity with absolutely no respect for the sacred traditions that other men and women may have received from their culture, from their ancestors, and to convert them to literalist Christianity. So this doctrine of eternal punishment in hell is an extremely central teaching of literalist Christianity. And yet it's all gravely mistaken. Just as the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent and the tree in the Garden of Eden can be shown beyond any doubt to be based on celestial metaphor, the description of hell or Sheol in the scriptures, Sheol in the scriptures is also celestial metaphor. In fact, virtually all of the imagery and figures in the scriptures we call the Bible, from Genesis all the way to Revelation and everything in between, is celestial metaphor. It's built on celestial metaphor. The same system of celestial metaphor that underlies the ancient myths of other cultures, the ancient myths of Egypt and of Mesopotamia and of ancient Greece and of ancient India and ancient China and Japan, and cultures that have retained their ancient traditions, such as in China and Japan, and the Norse myths and the sacred traditions of the cultures of the Americas and of Africa and of Australia and of the islands of the Pacific and so on around the world. So just to show a very few brief example discussion of what is going on with this description of hell or Sheol. In the book of Mark, for example, in the New Testament, we have a very vivid set of commands attributed to the figure of Jesus, the person of Jesus, who says that if your hand offends you, cut it off, for it's better to enter into life with one hand than to enter into hell with two hands, into the fire that shall never be quenched. And then the passage goes on to say, where their worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched. And then again, the next verse says, if your foot offends you, cut it off. For it's better to enter into life with one foot cut off than to be cast into hell with 2 feet into the fire that is not quenched. And then again, we see that same phrase, where their worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched. And then one more time, if your eye offends you, pluck it out, for it's better to enter into the kingdom of God with one eye than to be cast into hellfire with 2 eyes. And then that same refrain, quote, where their worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched, end quote. That's Mark chapter 9, verses 43 through 48. So what is this worm that dieth not, where the fire is not quenched? It's actually a paraphrase of a verse found in the scroll of Isaiah, chapter 66, which is filled with vivid imagery, which can be shown to be celestial in nature, including God extending peace like a river flowing down from God, but also predicting that the Lord shall come with fire and with his chariots like a whirlwind, that's celestial metaphor, and eventually making a new heaven and a new earth. And those that remain shall look upon the carcasses of the transgressors, of whom the text says, quote, for their worm shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched. That part's in Isaiah 66, verse 24. The worm, in this case, and in many other ancient myths and sacred stories, refers to the constellation Scorpio, almost certainly. This is found in the lowest part of the zodiac wheel, and it's partly submerged within the shining heavenly river of the Milky Way. So Scorpio, the constellation Scorpio, plays a worm, a serpent, a many-headed serpent sometimes, a dragon, which in older forms of English, dragons were also called worms, sometimes a many-headed dragon. Anyway, Scorpio is halfway in the Milky Way, and the Milky Way is elsewhere envisioned as a river, but also as a pillar of fire. And the constellation Scorpio is not just in any part of the Milky Way, but it's in the very brightest and the widest, the thickest part of the Milky Way, the most glorious, shining, brightest part of the Milky Way, that's widest in the whole Milky Way band, the part of the Milky Way known as the galactic center, or the galactic core, which appears in myth as a kind of a pool sometimes, or a lake, or a grotto in many ancient myths around the world. And I am convinced that's what the Bible is referring to as the lake of fire in other descriptions of scenes of hell, or the fires of hell, such as in Revelation chapters 19 and 20 and 21. There's a lake of fire described. And so that worm, the constellation Scorpio, that worm does not die. In fact, you can still see it to this very day at night in the outline of the constellation Scorpio, that great worm that doesn't die. It doesn't turn. It goes across the sky just like it always has, from east to west. And that fire that it's right next to and partially submerged in is not quenched. In fact, you can see it. You can see the bright, glorious, blazing ring of the Milky Way, and you can see the brightest, the widest, the thickest, shiningest part of the Milky Way, the galactic core, the galactic center, right to this very age. And that's where we also find Scorpio. So The worm doesn't die and the fire isn't quenched. And note also that in the description of John the Baptist, when he's preaching and baptizing at the River Jordan in Matthew 3, John the Baptist rails against the Pharisees and he calls them generation of vipers. How can ye escape the damnation of hell? So he's calling them a generation of vipers, a bunch of serpents. That's, again, I would argue this text is referring to Scorpio as the serpents or the generation of vipers, and that the Jordan River in this story is also associated with the Milky Way in the sky. Another figure, constellation, which is found adjacent to the same brightest part of the Milky Way, and in fact stands directly above the constellation Scorpio in the heavens, is the constellation Ophiuchus, an extremely important figure in the ancient worldwide system of celestial metaphor. And Ophiuchus has a distinctive oblong shape, like a tall rectangle topped with a triangle, and it's flanked by two serpent halves, and so it's called Ophiuchus, the serpent holder or the serpent bearer. This central body of Ophiuchus resembles a doorway or a portal or a gateway, and it plays, exact figure, it plays the role of a doorway or a gateway in many ancient myths and scriptures, and I would argue that it can be shown to play the role of the gate or the gates of the underworld in many ancient traditions, including the myths of ancient Greece. I spend a lot of time talking about that in my 2016 book, Star Myths of the World, Volume 2, about the mythology of ancient Greece. I also talk about it in the Norse myths. In my discussion of the Norse myths, this figure plays the role of the gates of hell. And in Matthew 16, Jesus references the gates of hell. Or in fact, the text says the gates of Hades, which is the Greek word, which is almost certainly a tradition that stems from this same constellation, the same tradition that's found in other cultures and other ancient myths around the world. There's other verses related to hell that reference these same figures, including the casting down of the dragon by the archangel Michael in Revelation 12, the dragon at one point being identified explicitly as Satan, and that's a passage which can be shown to be celestial in nature and which can be shown to be based on Ophiuchus and Scorpio, and it's consistently depicted as referring to Ophiuchus and Scorpio in artwork down through the centuries. So if these passages are based on celestial metaphor, does that automatically mean that there's no such thing as eternal torment in hellfire after death for some? No, it doesn't automatically mean that. But if the scenes being described are all based on the stars, then that's a pretty strong argument that these passages are metaphorical and esoteric and not literal. And remember also that I can show beyond doubt that the Adam and Eve story is based on the motions of specific constellations, and so it's not literal, which everyone should already know anyway since it features a talking serpent, but there's also strong arguments that its message, the Adam and Eve story, its message is esoteric, it's not literal. But when we take it literally, we come up with an inverted message. In that story, as we've seen, it's used theologically as the reason and the justification for this doctrine of eternal torment after death. So if that story is esoteric and metaphorical, then that's another major blow to the literalist teaching about hell. But then what are all these descriptions of hell and worms that don't die and fires that aren't quenched intended to teach us? What's the concept of hell really all about? Or Hades or Sheol? Well, notice that we do have descriptions of an underworld in other ancient myths, such as in the Greek myths. And there are descriptions of torments, such as the torment of Tantalus, who's always thirsty and hungry, standing in a river of cool water with a low-hanging branch heavy with fruit from a fruit tree just hanging just above him, but he's never able to get a taste of either the water or the fruit for all eternity. So he's tantalized by the fruit and the cool water that never can quench his thirst. Or the torment of Sisyphus, who has to roll a great rock up a hill, but it always rolls back down just before he reaches the top. And I've discussed these and other torments described in the Greek underworld in my 2016 book, Star Myths of the World, Volume 2, on the Greek mythology, where I argue that these are also based on celestial metaphor. I discussed the realm of the underworld in Norse myth in my 2018 book, Star Myths of the World, Volume 4, on Norse mythology. I discussed the realm of the underworld in Norse myth, which is also called Hell, spelled with one L. It's ruled over by a goddess called Hel, and of Hel, we're told in the Edda that the dish served at her table is known as hunger, and her bed is known as sickness or disease, and her knife is known as famine. Those who die in battle will be taken to Valhalla, but those who don't die a valiant death in battle are sent to this dreaded goddess in her realm, where her plate is called hunger. But in that volume, I suggest the possibility that this description of hell in Norse myth is actually describing this incarnate life, because things such as hunger and disease are conditions that we find in this life right here. And so are the frustrations described in the Greek myths associated with Tantalus and Sisyphus. I mean, do those descriptions ring true? Never being able to, always thirsty, always hungry, but never able to be satisfied. Or Sisyphus always rolling a rock up that rolls back down. These are metaphors for things that we experience right here in this life. And in fact, the lower half of the zodiac wheel, where we find Scorpio in Ophiuchus, can be confidently shown to be used in this ancient worldwide system of star myth to depict this incarnate life that we're in right now. In this interpretation that the ancient myths are actually describing the struggles of this life in a metaphorical way is argued by the brilliant author and explorer of the ancient myths and esoteric teachings, Alvin Boyd Kuhn, who lived from 1880 to 1963. And in his absolutely essential masterpiece entitled Lost Light, published in 1940, Alvin Boyd Kuhn provides overwhelming evidence that the gloomy realms described by the name Hades in ancient Greece, and by the name Amenta or Tatu or the Duat in ancient Egypt, or by the name Sheol in Hebrew, and by the name Hell in English, or Hell in Old Norse, where souls are imprisoned, captive, cut to pieces, and buried, are all metaphorical descriptions of our condition right now in this life. Kuhn points out that the realm of Amenta in the ancient Egyptian system is the dwelling place of the god Seb or Geb, the god of the earth. So Amenta is the earth, he argues. And on page 175, Kuhn plainly declares that, quote, in archaic philosophy, the field of our life here is depicted as the dark cavern, the pit, the abyss, the bleak desert, the wilderness, the grave, the tomb, the underworld, and hell, end quote. Kuhn argues, and I agree, that this teaching is esoteric and is intended to convey profound truths for us to use in this life, even this very moment, even in the present day. It's not about hellfire in some place of torment after death. And later in that same volume, he says with disgust that, quote, this theology of a fiery torment has suffered such an unconscionable distortion from its primary bearing and has afflicted the mind of mankind with so outrageous a delusion that every consideration points to the necessity of a vigorous handling in the interests of sanity and social benefit. The perversion of original teaching regarding the lower fire has cast over the collective mind of the Western world the foulest hypnotic obsession which it has ever suffered. The strangling tentacles of this theological devilfish have spread over the whole of Christendom and have compressed the spiritual genius of that segment of mankind into the coldest and most inhuman bigotry known to history." End quote. Kuhn argues throughout that book that the entire cycle of the year was imbued in this ancient system with esoteric significance, and that the upper half of the year and the lower half of the year were intended to convey to us a dramatic picture of spiritual struggle in which we must engage in this life, and which is very practical. The lower half is this life that we're going through now, and down there is where we find Scorpio and these images of hellfire and Underworld. And then at the top of the wheel we find the land of milk and honey. This is an argument I'm making based on, I'm adding in more constellations onto this wheel that Alvin Boyd Kuhn talks about, because the ancient system uses the constellations as an even more precise dial for this esoteric system. But at the top of the wheel, opposite of Scorpio, we find the summer solstice and the land of milk and honey up there in between Gemini and Cancer the crab. And the crab, Cancer the crab, has the beehive in the forehead of the crab. That's the honey in the other end of the Milky Way, the land of milk and honey. So some of the so this whole cycle is like a struggle. It's like a battle. It's like the Trojan War. It's like the Battle of Kurukshetra. It's like the different epic battles that we find throughout the ancient myths. And so some of the esoteric meaning that I would draw from this identification is that we're supposed to be engaging in this valiant battle here in this life, just like the heroes who will eventually wind up in Valhalla. Now, this isn't necessarily a literal battle with axes and swords and shields and, you know, two armies facing each other on the battlefield. This is the struggle of this life, which involves doing what's right and helping others and gaining wisdom in order to better help and uplift others, or not. And so that's what this struggle is about. But this struggle has nothing to do with converting people to a belief in a literal interpretation of the stories in the Bible. In fact, taking those stories literally leads to a grievous misinterpretation of what the ancient scriptures and ancient texts and ancient myths are trying to say. And as can be proven, those stories in the Bible and the imagery that they use are built upon the exact same system of celestial metaphor, which is operating in the ancient traditions and myths and sacred stories of the other cultures around the globe, the very same cultures that literalist Christianity has been going around and converting throughout history, and even today says, you know, to people who still have their traditional ways and their ancient traditions, is saying, you know, you have to convert to literalist Christianity, which is, as Alvin Boyd Kuhn says, an example of the coldest and most inhuman bigotry known to history. So this video has only barely scratched the surface of the evidence, which shows beyond doubt that the stories and figures in what we call the Bible, in common with the ancient myths of cultures around the globe, those stories are part of an ancient worldwide system of tremendous antiquity, so old that it was already fully formed in the earliest texts and stories of ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia and ancient India and other cultures. This information should really change everything that we think we know about ancient history. It's truly life-changing for us right at this very moment, as well as changing our understanding of history. And I'm convinced that these ancient myths still have a central theme that we need, the theme of healing trauma and healing alienation and recovery from that, which is a message that we need more urgently today than perhaps ever before. And I'm convinced that we can hear that message if we listen to the ancient myths in the language that they're actually speaking, which is a celestial language, a metaphorical language, and an esoteric language. Thank you so much.